Welcome to today's interview, which is part of the Stanford MBA Global Exploration Program. Our Global Explorations are student-led programs where the participants, who are also Stanford MBA students, immerse themselves for 10 weeks into a pressing business topic in an international context. I am Marie-Cristine Kaptan, one of the student leaders of this global exploration on climate change from European perspectives. I am honored to welcome here today Dan Jørgensen, the Climate Minister of Denmark. He is going to be interviewed by Melissa Zhang, Emilia Ling, and Alex Chang. And now I'll hand it over to Melissa to start us off with the interview.
Thank you so much, Marie-Cristine. So we're very excited today and have three themes of questions for you. So I'm going to kick us off with the first, which is the role of government in climate change. I'd love to ask you, can you tell us about the role that your government plays in driving climate change initiatives?
Yes, well, great question, Melissa. I think you can look at this from different perspectives. One is, what can we do as a government to affect global policy? And that is obviously a very relevant question also, but I'll start with a more domestic outlook. So I'll start by trying to answer, what can we do as a government to reduce emissions from our own country? And there we have different opportunities. Basically, you can say that there are four types of policy instruments that we can utilize. One is the most obvious, regulation. So basically, command and control. So you set regulation, and then afterwards you control as a state that the regulation is also actually followed. That could be setting standards for emissions of cars, for instance, or setting standards for how many pesticides and which types of pesticides the agricultural sector can use. Second type of policy instruments is public expenditure. So you can actually subsidize different types of, for instance, scientific research, or even production facilities, or as we've done in Denmark for several years, renewable energy technology. So we were the first country in the world, for instance, to have an offshore wind farm back in 1991. That was a pretty expensive endeavor, and most economists were probably shaking their heads and said that would never have happened on a marketplace. But because we used public money to do it, it became feasible. And today, of course, technology has developed, so now it competes with coal and nuclear in most parts of the world. Third policy instrument type is market-based instruments. So that would be, for instance, having a cap and trade system on emissions like the one we have in the EU, or use taxes and tariffs, like, for instance, a pricing carbon mechanism where you put a tax on carbon. And fourth is voluntary action. So you either hope that private citizens will do something because you then engage them via public dialogue or information campaigns, or you make agreements with companies, so you give them some advantages, and they then promise to reduce their emissions. We've done that with a big cement factory in Denmark, just to give you one example of how that could work. So that's basically the four types of policy instruments you have as a government.
Great. I'd like to ask a little bit about misaligned incentives. Minister, in your opinion, what do you see as the largest misaligned incentives among different climate stakeholders? And what do you think can be done to align these incentives?
Okay, let me see if I understand you correct. So you're asking whether or not there are different interest groups in a society that has opposing incentives, and if that can damage the development towards a green transformation?
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Well, the most obvious is obviously that we have a fossil fuel driven economy in Europe and also the United States still, even though we are now developing toward a green transformation where energy efficiency and renewable energy is at the forefront of most policies. Still, it is fair to say that we build our societies to a large degree on using fossil fuels and creating energy from fossils. And if you are a company or a country that are very dependent on, for instance, coal or oil, then you need to obviously find a new business model for it to be also for you lucrative to go into a green transformation. Now, my own country is a good example of that. We are the biggest oil producer in the European Union, but nonetheless, we've decided to stop exploration of oil and gas from 2050, and we have stopped all future licensing rounds in the North Sea. Now, why have we done that when we actually make money on it right now? Well, we've done it because we think even though we have a short-term incentive on using oil and gas, in the long term we know that first and foremost we need to fight climate change, but we also know that the economy is probably more likely to be in our advantage if we have green energy as the main part of our energy system.
Great, thank you so much. Moving along, we're wanting to know what policies and or technologies do you see as the top priorities, both within the Danish energy model and more broadly in the world over the next few years?
Well, fortunately, that correlates because we think that if we are to make a difference as a small country, we also need to look at deploying technologies and developing technologies that other countries and other parts of the world can also use. We are only responsible for 0.1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, so that in itself doesn't really make that much of a difference if we reduce. But if we do it in a smart way and if we push ourselves into innovative measures, then hopefully what we will develop will also be used elsewhere. And the technologies that we are focusing on now is, first of all, going into a new era of offshore wind. So we were the first country in the world with an offshore wind farm in 1991. Now we want to be the first country to create an offshore energy hub. We're building an artificial island 80 kilometers out in the sea, in the North Sea. So instead of having one offshore wind farm that's connected to the shore of a country, we will have several offshore wind farms connected to an artificial island that is then a hub for the energy transformation into different countries. So we'll have the hub connected to different other European countries, and we can also there combine it with new technologies such as power-to-X technology that can transform the power into liquid fuels that you can then put on maritime transport vessels or aviation or heavy transport vehicles on the streets. And that's then also another part of your question answered, because there's no doubt that we need to find ways of getting renewable energy into the parts of our energy system where it's difficult today, for instance, the transport sector. And power-to-X technology, where you take the electricity from the renewables via an electrolysis process, makes it into hydrogen, and then from hydrogen into liquid fuel, that is going to be a big part of the solution. And then a final technology that I will mention is carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and usage, because there's no doubt that we need to take some of the carbon from some of the sources where we cannot reduce it yet, capture it and put it into the ground. We are now using a lot of resources in Denmark on developing that technology, so that actually some of the same companies that used to make money exploring and extracting oil and gas will not extracting oil and gas will now make money putting the carbon into the ground instead of taking it out from the ground.
That's fascinating. I also love the point you made that it is key to your imperative to develop innovations that can be used elsewhere. I think that's very additive and valuable for global climate access and equity. So one thing that I'm very impressed by Denmark is that as a country, it has set ambitious targets of reducing greenhouse gases by 70% in 2030. So please correct me if I'm wrong. And I understand there's kind of a three-pillar approach that the country is also taking. So in context, this is 2 decades ahead of the US's 2050 pledge. I'd love to hear how this target was set and also how the 3 pillars contribute to achieving that.
Well, normally when countries set a reduction target, usually the way that happens is that you look at how many resources do you have at hand, which kinds of policy instruments do you have. Then you calculate it, and then you set up probably pretty conservative estimate, because as a policymaker you don't want to have a target that's too high, because if you don't reach it, then you are a failure, obviously. But that's a very defensive way of looking at these questions. So we've done it differently. So instead of asking what is possible, we've actually asked what is necessary. So we've looked at what scientists would say would be necessary for Denmark for us to fulfill our fair share of the Paris Agreement, that is to keep us below 1.5 degrees as a global community in increase in temperature. And there the answer was 70%. So we haven't asked what's possible, we've asked what's necessary, and our task then politically is to make the necessary possible. Now, this is a huge task for us, because we need to reduce now with as much from now till 2030 as we've done from 1990 until now. But we are pretty confident that it can be done. And to make sure that it will happen, we've made a climate law, so a climate act, that makes it legally binding for any government between now and 2030 to fulfill this target. And then the different policy measures that we will use, we will obviously deploy some of them now, some of them when we get closer to 2030. But I think it's fair to say that we need to do most of the things now, because we know that some of the technologies that we want to use, you need to start the investment already now for it to work in 2030, because actually 9 years is not that long a time frame. To give you one example, the energy island that I'm talking about probably won't be finished until 2030, maybe even 2033. So we need to get started now with the investments that will help us later.
Great, that's fascinating to hear about the advancements that you're thinking about till 2030. I want to ask a little bit about the pandemic. How do you feel that the pandemic has really shifted your thinking about climate change?
Well, Emilia, I'm not sure it has, to be honest with you. I do acknowledge that you can compare the two crises, because on one hand, yes, we are talking about a pandemic that's changed our lives, that is so serious that everybody agrees we need to act, just as is the case with climate change. But on the other hand, I think that the pandemic is a crisis where you can deploy different solutions here and now. For instance, let's get a testing system, let's vaccinate, let's have restrictions on how many people can be gathered, different places, all of that. And that is to face an immediate crisis that hopefully we will solve, and in a few months, hopefully, even have solved, right? Some say years, but let's hope it's months. On the other hand, climate change, it's a much bigger threat, but it's also a threat that in our lifetime probably we won't have solved it, but hopefully we will have gotten climate change into a more a state where we can control it more. But the solutions there are also much bigger, needs to be much bigger. We're talking about fundamentally changing societies, fundamentally changing our economies all over the planet. And this is not something you can do in a few months. We even also know that we need to develop new technologies that will take years and years to implement. I mentioned the Danish energy island as one, and the Power-to-X technology combined to that as one. But that's just one technology, and that's a technology that we more or less know how we want to develop, and we just need to bring it up in scale. But how about direct air capture, for instance, on carbon capture and storage? I think most scientists will also say that's probably also going to be part of the solution in the future, but we are far from a situation where that's feasible on a big scale yet. So that's just to mention one of the technologies that we need to develop.
That's refreshing to hear a longer term perspective, as the pandemic has affected everyone in the short term. Moving on to a question about differences in administrations. So in the US, at least, we've seen large swings in climate change policies from one administration to the next. And so how do you ensure that longer term initiatives like ending all new North Sea oil and gas exploration, how do you ensure all of that remains a priority when elected officials change?
Great question, Alex. In Denmark, we have a special parliamentary system in which we have a type of agreement that is called in Danish et forlig. In English, I'm not really sure what to call it. I don't know of any other country that has this, but it's sort of like a covenant. So when we make an agreement, a political agreement, there's two types that we can make. One is just basically an agreement. So we'll vote for this legislation, but then if we change our mind in 2 weeks, we can vote for a different legislation. But the big energy transformations that we've made in our country has been made in a different way. Here is where the covenant comes in. So if you are part of one of these big agreements, you are not allowed to change your mind, so to speak. So you have to stick to this agreement no matter what happens. So even if the majority changes after the next election, you can't just withdraw your support for this decision. The only way you can do it is you need to tell the public before an election that after the next election, I will withdraw from this agreement, and that almost never happens. So I think that's probably one of the. This is probably a little bit complex if you don't know the Danish multi-party system, but it's given certainty to the markets, so that this means that when we ask private companies to invest a lot of money, because we are really talking a lot of money in offshore wind farms, for instance, they need to be sure that the public support from the Danish government doesn't disappear after the next election. So that's why it's so valuable that when we make these broad political compromises and therefore also make a covenant, that makes the investment safe for them. And it also makes it safe for the public authority to start the planning, to use public money for the investment. So all in all, I would say that if I was to give an advice, I'm not sure I am, but if I was, I would say that one of the things that some countries could do, maybe the US included, was to make agreements cross-party and make them stick, and then make them stick after the next election and after the next election. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, how will you get the certainty in the markets that these things will actually happen? Did that make sense at all?
Yes, it's a really interesting model. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice and comes at an interesting time with the new administration here in the United States. So for our last section, we'd love to learn more about you and your career. would you mind sharing what you see as the defining moments of your career that led to where you are today?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think I would say that it started actually when I was a child, because I loved the nature. I loved watching birds. I loved being in the forest, and that interest stuck with me. Also, when I started my university studies, I studied political science, and that also led to me meeting the Minister of Environment and Climate at that time. Actually, maybe you can see him in the background. I don't know if I can move this. There's a photo of a guy on a bicycle in the background. That's my mentor, Svend Auken. He was minister at that time. Unfortunately, he passed away some years ago. But he then became my mentor because he came to the university to give speeches quite a lot, but he wasn't really that used to all the young people being interested in politics. He wasn't used to people also being interested in the environment, because 25 years ago wasn't really that hot a topic. But I was, so I got to know him, and he took me under his wings, and he got me into politics. And I started as a young candidate for the European Parliament and was elected at the age of 29, and served in the European Parliament for almost 10 years as Vice Chairman of the Environment Committee. And then I was appointed Minister for Food and Agriculture and Fisheries and served for a year and a half. Then we lost the election and were in opposition for some years. And then I came back as Minister for Climate, Energy and Utilities 1 year and a half ago. That was a tour de force.
It's amazing to hear how you started with this passion for the environment at such a young age. I'm curious to understand, for students that you that also have shared this similar passion, what advice would you give them in terms of in the future trying to make a dent into sustainability?
Well, I was going to say earlier, but I didn't get the time when you all introduced yourself that, wow, you're the guys that I'm counting on to save the planet. So what are you doing, wasting your time speaking to me? Here you should be home reading your books, finishing your education. But seriously speaking, I think that it's just amazing how young people all over the world are now not only interested but also feel passionate about the green transformation, and having it not only as a hobby but also as something that is an integrated part of their education is extremely important, because we need across different professions people who knows about these topics and people who are engaged in these topics. So we need the medical profession. I think, was it you, Emilia, who was a med student also? We need engineers. We need journalists. We need lawyers. We need all professions, across all professions, to have people that are engaged in these discussions.
We'll take those as motivating words, Minister Jørgensen, but thank you for the time today. We really appreciate the time and your work for helping Denmark become a global leader in climate change initiatives.
You're very welcome.
I would like to echo that. Thank you for sharing some of your time with us today and for all the important work that you do. And there's certainly a lot that we can all learn from Denmark. So thank you, Mr. Jørgensen.
Thank you.